As anyone who has watched this channel knows, I'm a big fan of experimentation in metal, in incorporating other genres and pushing the boundaries. But the very nature of that expression, pushing the boundaries, suggests that at a certain point, it stops becoming metal and starts becoming something else entirely. What is that point? And who decides where that point is? The musicians? The fans, or history? Welcome to Daily Metal, where every day a different metal album gets dissected for your sadistic listening pleasure. I'm the heavy metal lawyer Emma, and in this show I'll talk about why the music in these albums is so good and where they fall in the history of music's most wretched genre. On August 30th, 1993, Atheist brought the band back together to challenge the limits of metal with their album Elements. Founded in 1984 under the name Oblivion, it would take the band a while to put out their first album, Piece of Time, in 1990. The album gave the band its place in the somewhat disputed list of the big four of technical death metal, alongside Death, Pestilence, and Cynic. I say somewhat disputed more as to technical death metal being its own genre than these bands being the ones who created that particular sound. Technical death metal is really just death metal incorporating complex instrumentation, especially sounds and techniques borrowed from jazz music. Is that enough to make it its own subgenre? I don't think so, but it is indisputable that these bands in the Florida death metal scene in general sought to push death metal into new territories. For bands like Death, it really was all about technique, both in terms of songwriting and instrumentation, which I'll talk about a lot more in tomorrow's video, so stay tuned. But Atheist showed they were equally, if not more, interested in pushing the genre of their music as they were in pushing the technical aspects of it, with their second album, Unquestionable Presence. Unquestionable Presence united three key sounds: death metal, progressive metal, and jazz fusion. Progressive metal was essentially the metal version of progressive rock music. Stuff like King Crimson, Yes, and Rush, and it applied the same drive of complexity that music had. Jazz fusion is a big umbrella term for a number of different jazz crossover sounds that emerged in the early 1970s following the death of John Coltrane. It really can't be overstated how big of a presence Coltrane had been in jazz music, making some of the best records of the bebop era of jazz, incorporating soul music into jazz, and laying the groundwork for free jazz. After his death, it didn't make sense to keep playing bebop or free jazz, and Miles Davis made the bold decision to put out an album called Bitches Brew in 1969, which was a record fusing jazz with psychedelic rock music. Herbie Hancock made an album called Headhunters in 1973, a record fusing jazz with early electronic and funk music. And probably most relevant for this video, Chick Corea put out his album, Return to Forever, in 1972, fusing jazz, progressive rock, and Brazilian bossa nova music. Returning to Atheist, the band essentially took on the same jazz fusion mantra. You could really call them death metal fusion, of trying to freshen up the sound of death metal by fusing it with other genres. Their second album had a tragic backstory, with Atheist bassist Roger Patterson dying in a tour van accident before the album was actually recorded. And I'm guessing this was a big factor in the band wanting to dissolve after that album. But they were in a contract with Metal Blade Records that required a third album. So in a shockingly quick 40 days, Atheist put together their third album, the album of the day, Elements. The opening track to Elements, Green, while having a quirky and chaotic intro, is the most straightforwardly metal track on the album. Despite some eerie, clean guitar passages and bass noodling, it sounds pretty much like 90s death metal. Water, the second track, deceives you into thinking that it will follow that same path until it breaks out into a Spanish guitar type solo, goes back to death metal, and then the Spanish guitar solo returns again. And it is probably around this point that you realize that the rhythms in the song are actually more like a samba than typical death metal. And the band, goes full mask off with that, with the track after that, which is called Sambo Brisa, which is straight up a samba song. For those who don't know, samba is Afro-Brazilian dance music that is basically the grandpa of bossa nova music. It's less than 2 minutes long, but that's more than enough time to make you question whether this is really a metal album that you're listening to. As Terrorizer magazine said at the time, the album goes to the edge of metal. While this certainly isn't something that I would listen to regularly, the band's quick switch up of styles in every section of every song really makes it like the opposite of catchy, and it is somewhat disorienting to listen to. But it is inarguably an interesting album and a great one to listen to and reflect and ponder on what metal really is. If you do pig squeals over bachata music, is it metal? If you have down-tuned distorted guitar playing microtones over doumbek drum, is it Arabic-influenced metal or traditional Arabic music fused with metal? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you like this video, please subscribe so you can find out what the metal album of the day is, why it is so brutal, and where it fits in the history of the genre.